Hello, namaskaram, Kamya ji.
Namaste, namaste.
Um, for everyone who is looking into this podcast, Kamya ji is a spiritual influencer as well as a creator, and she's also doing a lot of spiritual programs for the youth. I'd like to introduce Kamya ji. If you want to introduce yourself to our audience, a few words on that before we
Sure,
go into that. Yeah.
sure. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. And I actually grew up in England. I was born there. I'm a British Indian. And after finishing my master's degree, I studied economics. I decided to pursue a digital nomad lifestyle. So essentially working from my laptop, being in location independent, went through different types of online ventures. I was also heavily into academia. Um, and then eventually came into content creation, social media. And so that's how I started my page, and then how I started expanding on that. Spirituality has been a part of my life since I was born, but I would say the major junction of a so-called spiritual awakening was in 2011, where I kind of drastically had to shift my whole lifestyle because of a certain psychological traumas that I was undergoing, which is how I then came onto the path of meditation, natural health, met a Guruji here in India, and then continue that. And then after my college, I really felt that there was something missing in the life that I was seeing in London, where people were making millions of dollars and pounds. There was this emptiness, there was a void. And so that's how I then decided to continue by exploring the world, essentially solo traveling. And eventually now my journey has led me here in Bharatvarsh.
Wow, wonderful. So I have just gone through your content a bit, and I saw that you do a lot of spiritual healing things, and you have gone through a different kind of a spiritual journey. Everyone has their own individual spiritual pursuit. But I see that you travel across the world, and you are not only accustomed with the Indian culture, but you have you have Western, the Western culture. For example, I've seen some Indonesian clips and all. So how do you see, like, in terms of the Indian culture, the Sanatan Dharma, the Hindu way of life, and also leaving aside the traditional Hindu way of things, and mostly like how people are not no, not following the traditional part, but integrating new ways, new discoveries related to spirituality. So how does all this comes into place, and your own understanding, what your vision
Yeah.
is, like how you are taking this ahead?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very kind of holistic question. I think it's really important to discuss the nature, the state or the sthiti of spirituality in today's day. On the one hand, we have New Age spirituality, and I myself been heavily exposed to New Age spirituality. I've lived in Bali, I've lived in Thailand for several months in these spiritual communities where literally, there are like tons of yoga centers, and there's like tons of vegan and vegetarian restaurants, and everyone greets you with namaste, even if they are American or Italian or anything like this. So, and it's great. New Age spirituality is essentially a blend of different cultures, including the shamanic traditions, African traditions, ancient Egyptian traditions. At the same time, in the New Age spirituality space, a lot of it is actually taken from Hinduism. For example, the concept of chakras, kundalini, yoga, tantra, all these terminologies are specifically from Hindu traditions, and not from the modernized versions of Hinduisms that we see in today's day, which makes it easy. Of course, it has its benefit to make it more easy and accessible for the average person who is new to spirituality. But the dangers of this are actually very vast. So I would say that as much light is there in the spiritual community and so many good things are happening, there is also this dark aspect which people are not talking about. And so what happens is when you take a sacred knowledge system out of its traditional context, and that's why in Hindu dharma, in the traditions, we have a guru shishya parampara. So for example, if you think the podcast with Rajarshi Nandi, who spoke about tantra on Ranveer Ahluwadia's podcast was quite famous, and I think that's a great start to watch to understand that concept, especially within this area of tantra, which has become so popularized in the West and in India. That if you don't take the diksha for certain types of things, and you just try and take these things into your own hands, and if you try and then extract it from the traditional origin and make it into something of your own, there is a great harm that can happen to the energy system, because it's like dealing with a live wire. It's a very esoteric. It's some things that have been passed down for thousands of years through the generations. And so that's what, coming to Sanatan Dharma, I think, being literally such a diverse and such a specific at the same time civilizational identity and traditions. So there are certain sampradayas, there are certain paramparas, like for example, the Nath yogis. So, the Nath traditions, they also initiate non-Hindus into their sect, for different practices or mantras. So I think, the Vedanta you have, then you have, of course, yoga, which is now globally famous. So I think as a person who is seeking to learn more about Hindu traditions, there are so many avenues, but it's important to have that level of independent inquiry to understand what is coming from the origin and what is not.
Cool. So when we talk about independent inquiry, see, you formed your own path because of that independent inquiry, right? And everyone forms their own path, but and I think it's most common in nowadays to have that sense of independent inquiry, because if something feels imposed on us, let us say we are imposed a certain framework or something, we feel like we are caged into that box. So everyone wants to come out of the box. So coming to the independent inquiry, what do you think about? So you said you had a guru from India, and you received the methods or whatever you are doing. So how do you see in terms of gurus, and what's your perception of gurus? Let us say Osho, Krishnamurti, and there are many wonderful masters, but widely popular ones are Osho, Krishnamurti, Ramana Maharshi, Sadhguru. So how do you see that kind, like learning from a guru? How do you see that part also?
So I think each and every spiritual figure who has risen to the forefront has had something valuable to offer, has had a specific role to play at that time in humanity. For example, Osho. But then there is also a distinction, I feel, between what we would say, and in Sanskrit, we have different categories of teachers. So for example, someone who delivers knowledge is one category. So that could be informational knowledge. And then someone who follows the traditions of the scriptures is then a different category of teacher. And then, someone who is specifically focused on delivering moksha. So that is a different category. So I won't be able to go through those now, but people can read more about this. I think it depends on each person's individual journey and what they need the most at that point of life. And I think sometimes these gurus, they come into your life on their own at the time that you need them the most. But I think the key here is to understand that ultimately the journey, first of all, is your own. So simply staying attached to, say, watching YouTube videos and thinking that's going to lead you to enlightenment is a common mistake that I think, some of us make when we become very attached. And then, it's also a process of us doing our own seeking. And the second thing I would say is that a lot of the gurus that we have, gurus of the past, like you mentioned, Ramana Maharshi, Sri Aurobindo, Paramahansa Yogananda. So these were gurus who really attained Jivan Mukti, or, Mukti in this body. And so I think it is, there's a vast range of things, that people can resonate with or not resonate with. Ultimately, I think a person has to be guided by their own intuition, and as far as possible, seek the traditions. Things do also connect back to the deities. So, for example, some sort of worship of a deity or something like this. But yeah, I think it's different for everyone.
Yeah, so when we talk about deity worship, I have also felt that in my life. So like in Hinduism, there is a feminine worship. So I come from a culture of where there is no no objectified worshiping. So people say if there is some object, it's like, but I came across that through Sadhguru, like the
Yeah.
Devi temple out there. And I did not knew logically what's Devi is about, what's the form is, but I could literally feel some kind of a huge presence, more of a feminine, more of an emotional nature.
Yeah.
So I think it's alive, but yeah, to put it logically means it's a very difficult task, because that's where it gets distorted, I think, when you try to
Yeah.
put the present.
Yeah, I think it's a subjective experience, and it's an internal experience as well, like what you mentioned about feeling energies. And I think that's why spirituality, sometimes we tend to separate spirituality from normal life when it is related to absolutely everything that we do, like what we eat, what we're putting in our body, how we're doing our dincharya, what types of media we're consuming, what are the people around us, because all of these things are affecting our consciousness. And all of these things are affecting our ability to perceive these energies. So if you think about like maybe 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, how did the ancient rishis perceive the Vedas? How did they perceive that the planet Mars is red and we have a Mangal Mandir in Ujjain way before a telescope was invented? So what does this mean is that they were communicating telepathically with the universe, and this is seen and evidenced across every single ancient culture, like the Incas as well, Mayas, etc. And so the modern lifestyle that we consider normal now, right? If we actually look at what is in our food, the heavy metals in the pharmaceutical medications, for example, these have an effect on the chakra system. And because we have reduced life to material, so this is just the body and the material world outside of me, is that too often we're not sensitive to the things that you mentioned. And I think that's a huge source of disconnect, not just from the natural world and the spiritual beings, but to ourselves as well.
So I think that's where you are trying to bring people's attention towards their inward and more sensitivity, right? That's for healing, and so that they could feel things more, instead of going in a more compulsive manner. They could feel the things around them, feel nature. So is it something like that? So tell something about your healing programs, because so coming to the deity part, I'd just like to add something for our
Yeah.
audience also. So if you know the world-renowned Institute of Physics, the CERN Institute, they have installed a Shiva statue in there, and Shiva in a Nataraj posture. So it's all top scientists of the world, they refer to the Nataraj posture as a replication of the cosmos. So there are deities which represent the cosmic story, because you say that Mangal, Graha and temple. So I just got reminded of it, because I think Hindu stories are very well crafted. I don't know how the rishis did that, because but it sums up the entire cosmos and universe in a very analogical format. So tell something about your courses, like what's this is about, and how are you trying to bring well-being, and what is your initiative?
Yeah. Well, definitely, the case of us becoming more aware of ourselves. I think what I've noticed is that a lot of the struggles that I face, that I've had to break through, whether it's, my karmic patterns, past traumas, limiting beliefs, or this lifestyle that I have, which is a digital nomad lifestyle, I think all of it essentially comes down to inner work. And as much as, the modern colonized world is really focused on the kind of left brain aspect of life. So, like skills and, all this, and like the left brain education, but the intuitive education, the magic, the traditions, the ancient science, the ancient wisdom, all of that is now making a massive comeback, because we have this imbalance. We have an ecological imbalance. We have rising depression rates. And it's not just because, okay, we want to solve mental illness, or but I think it's about, for me at the core, it's about empowering others to be free, because that has been I think a theme across everything that I've done, whether it's traveling, whether it's spiritual seeking, or anything else. And that source of freedom, what we seek, the source that we seek, it does come from inside of us. And so these different knowledge systems, these different healing systems, whether it comes from the Hindu traditions, so primarily my main focus is on Hindu traditions, and also shamanic traditions and some elements of New Age spirituality. So, for example, working with the cycles of the moon, doing full moon ceremonies, sometimes working with plant medicines like blue lotus and cacao. And, these plants also have a very kind of profound effect on our consciousness as well. So there are lots, there are like a wide range of things, as well as, I think ultimately equipping people to tap into their own inner healing abilities, and actively using them to create their life.
Wonderful. So one more thing, like when you talk about these plants, right? So I've
Yeah.
seen you use them, and you also have a website, I guess, where these plant products are there. So something more about these plant-based products, because definitely they have a healing impact. Let us say people are using ayahuasca in the West completely, but what
Right.
kind of plants these are and how it can benefit people, and also like is it a venture that you are doing, or how the business side of it? Yeah. So how is it?
Yeah, so I mean, what you mentioned, ayahuasca is a whole different ball game. So that is a plant indigenous to the Amazon jungle, and that's an entheogenic plant. So basically, it does have visionary properties. So people do get visions, may even get visions of their childhood, of their past lives. It essentially induces an altered state of consciousness. So ayahuasca is one psychedelic plant which should only be worked with in a ceremonial context with the shamans. So again, there's a lot of issues of fake shamans, even within Peru itself, many of the retreat centers. So with these things, of crucial importance is to do research. So I myself have been to Peru. I've met people from Inca lineage. I've met people from the Shipibo tribe who work with these medicines to understand how their culture is and what the significance is. And it has been enlightening to see the parallels between their culture and the Vedic traditions. Then other types of plants, for example, coming back home to Bharat, is, for example, the blue lotus flower, so also known as Neel Kamal in Sanskrit. So again, it's a flower, so it's not psychoactive as such, but it is worshipped by the ancient Egyptians, has great significance in healing on an emotional and mental level. But also can have, support meditation, support visualizations, and connects to the third eye as well. Neel means blue. So there are like many such things which I have seen that, especially for people who are really, even dependent on the chemical way of life, right? The artificial things, that these plants can have a really therapeutic, and they're completely harmless. Like a tea can have a very therapeutic and uplifting effect on the mind.
Wow. So I think definitely people who are watching this, so it should not be tried just like that, right? So there is a
Blue
way of
lotus is fine. Yeah, I mean, blue lotus is not a psychoactive, but then again, ayahuasca as a whole is an entheogenic plant. So yeah, like you said, there is a way of understanding. I do have an article on how to find retreats and stuff like this. I'm not sure if it's still there. I have to look for it. But yeah, other things definitely, like for example, even different types of herbs within Ayurveda also have these types of effects and can be accessed legally and easily.
Cool. So yeah, Ayurveda is a wholly different science. So it's a very interesting topic because if we go into Ayurveda, there's almost every solution for a proper diet. For everything, there's a solution. So maybe
Everything, yeah.
yeah, so I'd like to talk about that maybe. So the thing is, okay, so before coming to this part of things. So when you see that, okay, so I understand you are doing spirituality and your main audience is in, let us say, India, or is it or international audience, right? But when you see, let us say, in Bharat, but people are not connected to this side of spirituality. If you say 80% the Hindu population, rest is like Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, Jains, Sikhs, and all these things. But definitely within the Hindi community, there is an awareness, deep awareness. But if you see, it's all religiously dominated, right? Liberalism and the communist philosophy, the socialist philosophy, capitalist, and now there is like pro-nationalism and hyper-nationalism. So it's like all different kinds of ideology mixed up with religion and the state. Now people have become, only sake of protecting the ideology, they are defending everything. So So how do you see all this if you want to take spiritual? Because I see even the spiritual masters are finding it difficult to unite people because of the ideological things. So how do you see this? Like when there is so much of ideological divisions in a modern now, 2023. So how do you see integrating it, or how do you see that people should perceive? So what do you think about this?
That's a really interesting question. And I think something that a lot of people wonder, especially because a country like Bharat, not just in terms of the political ideology, but our identities themselves, our ancestral identities are so diverse, from each geography, you can go to a different state and they don't understand your language. And then we have different jatis, we have different tribes, different kula devtas, different gram devtas. Every village will have its different devta with different ritual, different ahar, different offerings. So I think the key thing here is, I think something that, we often misconceive unity to be homogeneity. That unity can only come if we think the same, if we have the same identity, if, we are all categorize ourselves in the same way. And so, some people, if you say, for example, speak about human rights, or, people will say, oh, why are you Hindu? Why don't you just be a human being? I'm allowed to be all things at once. I think that is the essence of multi-dimensionality. Like, I'm allowed to be, this human being in a body. These are my ancestors, and this is my land, and, this is my soul. At the same time, I'm also a multi-dimensional reflection of the universal consciousness, which is beyond any label, name, time, anything. So I think to resolve that kind of conflict intellectually, for me at least, is the idea that I have to find union within myself, that I can't change the outside world. And I think even if people have differences, if a person is true to themselves, and even if there are disagreements, we can learn to voice ourselves with compassion. At times, compassion, can't be used, of course, in extreme cases like some abuse or, human rights issues. But as far as possible, I feel that if we focus on equipping people to explore their own consciousness and become more aware, that unity will happen on its own, just through the individual.
Okay. So when you think about, okay, so this is an identity issue. I understand the spiritual side of things, but you have stayed in the West and you have seen gender identity. Now the West is completely into a big gender identity crisis. And even children are being in a confused stage whether they are a man or a woman. They don't even know that. So it's like 13-year-old children
Very
are
concerning.
it's very dangerous because it has been made into a movement. And so I'm not saying these people should not be, but the use of pronouns, and how do you see this whole thing of liberalism being expanded to something which Elon Musk or people like Jordan Peterson term as wokeness, the woke virus. So how do you see this liberalism, pseudo liberalism or woke thing?
Yeah, I think the term woke, the kind of woke ideology that we've seen has come up, and this has come up by design, not by accident. These things are planned years in advance by the so-called elites, because if you look at these movements, they are not organic, they are funded by elite billionaires. Also, if we look at what happened in 2020 and how there was a lot of funding and marketing to push a certain narrative, and anyone who opposed that narrative was called a conspiracy theorist, or was told to shut down their account through social media for a range of issues. And I think this is one of them as well. The second thing is that it becomes a kind of cult ideology when you're not allowed to criticize, and if you do, you're labeled with a phobic label. Okay, now you're phobic, or you're bigot, or you're right-wing, or anything like fascist in these terms. So I think the issue of wokeness essentially cancels any sort of authentic communication. Because if we look at the actual issue, yes, LGBTQ and trans people are, deserving of respect and acceptance in society, and that's a whole other issue. But if we look at what you mentioned, is that the agenda is different. So through the agenda of the so-called rainbow activism, we are seeing that now slowly they are pushing narratives that children can switch their gender, to the point where children who are under the age of 10 have been operated on. Their private organs have been operated on in the name of gender affirming care. And I just saw a diagram on Twitter a few days ago where there are statistics of the number of clinics of this gender affirming cares have multiplied massively. And so we can see that this propaganda machine, which is liberalism, which is what people term as fashionable, is operating through the media, through the celebrities, through the education system as well. I think it was in Florida or somewhere they had to ban some books which were teaching children, explicit acts, which otherwise should not be there, right? So I think this is what happens when a society drifts away from dharma, right? In any sense, regardless of a person's religion or their, ethnicity, the dharmic consciousness has a lot to offer us, because it curtails this type of moral dilemma where people are so confused about their morals, they're willing to operate on children.
Okay. So no, this is very painful, and like in Bharat, we fortunately we do not have that.
It's coming though. It's coming fast.
It's rising, but yeah, I have seen the IBM ads on pronouns. IBM India launched an ad, and there even Starbucks.
Yeah, so I want to add another thing to that as well, is that, so what happens is when you say, okay, I'm not going to use pronouns, and people say, oh, why? It's just a pronouns. But we need to understand this is a slippery slope, because when you subscribe to pronouns, I am then subscribing to an entire ideology of wokeness, which lands up with the children in school being told that you don't need to have a gender, and then you can just operate on yourselves. So I think it's important for Indians also to realize the way that these narratives are formed are very subtle, and just going with the mainstream because everyone's doing it is how we destroy ourselves, essentially.
Yeah, so in India, I think people do not have that much of clarity because they think everything is either pro BJP or pro Congress, or pro right wing or pro left wing. But yeah, so when you say about the leftists in India, or like I just saw this Bill C-16 by Jordan Peterson. He essentially raised this issue of pronouns back in 2016 or 2011 when it was passed in Canada. So he spoke about that I will not use pronouns, and it landed him in a lot of trouble because Canada was passing that law, and he got suspended and many things happened. But now it is almost common in LinkedIn. I see people using pronouns everywhere. It's like, people a girl is using. So I will not go into that specifics, but it's really strange that we human beings are behaving like this. I think it's an essential an identity conflict that people do not know that they are not this body. It's again come back to spirituality, like, having a sense of the consciousness within. It's not there deeply. So it's all identification with the body that is, allowing them to define only the body. They just are stuck to. I think that's where Bharat has to play a very big role in the spiritual tradition. Like, driving them back into the consciousness and, meditating a bit so that distancing from the body and the mind a bit.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think in some sense, it can be validating for some people. And, even in India, we have, for example, the third gender, but the difference here in the Western and the dharmic view of this issue of transgenderism, for example, is that here they are a specific small community who have a certain devi they worship, and they themselves are worshipped in religious festivals and all. Whereas in the West, it's not about any sort of kind of religious or indigenous identity. It's more about fashion, and like forcing this on children is where I think we need to draw the line, because as a consenting adult, you can literally do anything that you want. But the minute that you start to push your ideology on children, I think when it comes to the human body, I think that's where anyone of any political spectrum should draw the line.
Exactly. So I think they also want to increase their numbers because everything is about numbers, whether it's a religion or political party. So they don't care about humanity as such. So yeah, so I think that's a very big issue, and let us see where it goes forward in terms of, but definitely you should be aware about it. So let me ask you some light questions. Let us say your Instagram, right? So you have a lot of followers. You have, I have seen. So how do you connect with your audience? What is it that the audience feels in you, and how do they resonate with you? So what's the
Yeah.
core essence of your personal brand and how you do things?
Yeah, I think Instagram has been a great friend, a great companion to me. When I started my page in the end of 2016, I was in Sikkim in the Northeast. And actually, during my university, I spent 3.5 years in a kind of state of social isolation. So I didn't talk to anyone, I didn't go out, deleted my iTunes, I was like completely shut down because of, the events, that had happened to me earlier. And then eventually, when I came out of my zone, there was this intrinsic need to share my experience. That there was something missing, that I needed that human connection, because we are an interdependent network at the end of the day. And I think if you look even in the Hindu traditions, there is one path, which is the path of sannyas, which again needs a diksha. It's not just something you can just leave home and decide, okay, now I'm a sannyasi. And then there's the path of the grihas. So there are only these two different roads. And so the path of the sansar, being in the world. And so I had to kind of come back to the world and acknowledge that, I needed the world, and then the world needed me as well. So then I started sharing my travel experiences, my spiritual experiences. And that's how I started growing my page. It grew pretty much organically. And I love to connect with people. So I do Instagram meetups. I've done a lot of plastic cleanup drives. It's been difficult managing everything. I do workshops, do meditation circles, and I'm doing group trips as well. So sometimes it does get difficult to kind of cope up, but I think as much as possible, I try to respond to the needs of the audience, and what type of information they're asking me, what questions they're asking me, and then try and structure things accordingly to help them out in their journey.
Cool. So also about your health and the kind of things that you use. So when we see natural, you promote a lot of natural diet and natural kind of things. So what do you say about this? I know everyone definitely has their own personal choice when it comes to food and natural products and all of that. So how do you see, being naturally healthy, and what kind of a routine you have for your own, personal meditation or, natural health care?
Yeah, I think, healthcare is a massive thing. And I think the one of the misconceptions that we have is that we are separate from nature, right? And so if you look at, we have this idea that, the world outside of us is this big thing that we can't change. But the world outside of us is made up of individuals like us, based on our simple things like our daily consumption choices. Like, what fruits and vegetables, what is the ecosystem we are feeding into when we purchase one apple? Is it a corporate dairy industry where cows are being fed hormones and inflicted through a lot of pain, right? That one carton of milk that I purchase, what karma is that creating? Or if I'm buying milk from a indigenous A2 Goshala where the cows are roaming free, and in the Vedic method, actually, it's the calf that milks first, and then it's taken for human consumption. I mean, I'm not saying that everyone can afford to do that, because there may be differences in prices and stuff. But as far as possible, how can we decolonize our consumption choices has been a big part of my health journey. Because food is one thing, but then we have things like beauty products, we have toiletries. And so I have pretty much switched most of my makeup to organic makeup. Like now there's a lot of brands that are coming up in India. My toiletries as well, like these types of Ayurvedic brands. And I find that they're actually more effective, so better for my skin, better for my hair. And when it comes to food as well, as far as possible, organic or heirloom produce. Because again, the food system is one major cause of disease because of the artificial farming methods. And then the second thing is genetically modified seeds. So the nutrition that we should be getting, oftentimes we are not getting. And so, of course, stocking up on fresh fruits and vegetables, but as far as possible, kind of more organic and natural produce.
Wow. So do you have a personal yoga routine, or like what kind of rituals would you be comfortable in sharing something like that? Like what kind of rituals or personal meditation methods that you do?
Yeah, so I do have a morning routine. So it varies what time I wake up. If I'm traveling, then it can be late. Sometimes, as far as possible, I try to wake up before sunrise. So some days it can be like I'm waking up. There's periods phases where I'm like waking up at 4 every day and I'm feeling fantastic. And then sometimes my body needs more rest. So I try to listen to the cycles of my body is the first thing when it comes to my morning routine and my waking routine. Second thing is a combination of mind, body, spirit, and energy. So body, I do some basic Surya Namaskars. Trying to exercise is my weak point. Definitely pranayams. I also do various different chanting methods, mantra jap. Also do a daily Panchopchar Puja, which is basically worship of deities with 5 different offerings which correspond to 5 elements. So this again has a deep impact on, because we are made up of the elements too. So then there is a science behind that on how it affects your energy. And some other elements, like for example, journaling. I have a lot of crystals here. So depending on how I feel on that particular day, then I may do other things like crystal healing and various different things.
Wow. So I think we have pretty much covered many topics that we'd like to speak. So would you like discussing more on the politics side of spirituality, fake gurus, and all those kind of things?
We could discuss that. We could also discuss just the political scenario in terms of colonization, how colonization has affected our understanding of history, how it has caused us to demonize our, different spiritual traditions, or, something like this also, just on decolonization.
Yes. So, okay, so coming now to the aspect of more to political side, because people are mostly interested and hyped by political topics. If you see everywhere, that's the trend.
Yeah.
But so we see that in India, the rise of right-wing people, like top influencers like TheJHPodcast. I did not call him an influencer. He's an advocate and he's a legal expert, but yeah, so Anand Ranganathan, and there are many people who are rising into the space, not because they're offering something which was not in the tradition, but something that was very much needed. So very much needed in terms of restoring and reclaiming the Bharatiya identity. Where people got lost in the West. So what do you think about this whole decolonization, decoloniality thing, and where do you think the idea of being a global citizen and the idea of being a Bharatiya and reclaiming one's identity? So how do that balance lies? What do you think about that?
Definitely. I mean, like you mentioned, we see a massive rise in, I would say, awareness. It's still just rising. And on the one hand, you have the fact that the Hindu identity and voice has been suppressed and, of course, colonized. So through colonization invasions, firstly, it was Islamic invaders for 800 years. Then it was British invaders for 200 years. It was Portuguese invaders as well. Different types of invaders have come and force converted the natives. So this is the history, and we see this across India, even in certain parts of Gujarat. We know that there's many that communities who've been converted, but they are still following their ancestral artworks and the handicrafts and things like this. So we can see the effect of colonization with the destruction of temples, and then the education system is a major one. So the British are fully responsible for installing a very false narrative of history and using the education system to essentially further enslave, further dominate the consciousness of the natives and take them away from their spiritual consciousness. And so, that's one aspect where there are serious human rights issues as well. For example, the declining population of Hindus in Pakistan, who are almost non-existent now. And even in certain parts of India. And then on the other hand, you have people saying that, oh, now there's a lot of, like, as you mentioned, hyper-nationalism, or like Hindutva, or all these terms are used. And so I think what happens is when we talk about politics, is that it's important to put the labels aside and think more in terms of issues on an independent basis. I think that's how we can find more understanding and have more easy dialogue. A lot of the issues, are very much irrelevant. And I think that every type of Indian citizen, every type of Bharatiya should understand that, for example, if Italy is a Christian country, Italy will have, Christian leader, it will have, domination of the church. But unfortunately, India, being indigenously a Hindu country, was stripped of its identity. So I think the first step is acknowledging that the fact that Hindu people want to reclaim their identity of Sanatan Dharma, which of course benefits everyone, right? That this isn't something that is, right wing or fascist or anything like this, the way it's labeled. It's simply a case of, restoring what once was. And that is across every domain, through the education system, through governance, through even things like farming techniques and things like this. So I think, India is a country that has gone through a lot of pain, a lot of trauma. And it's time that, especially for the kind of Indic peoples, to really understand what has been the history of this land. Because if you look at it, it's not just this land, this is all of our story. This is the entire world, which was colonized by Abrahamic religions and were wiped out. So the Mesopotamian civilization was wiped out. The Mesoamerican civilizations, again, Africa, heavily colonized. Europe completely destroyed European paganism. So now that's why Christianity is prevalent in Europe. And I think it takes a level of maturity to take that step back and understand, okay, ultimately, even though, there are so many, different people belonging to different faiths, which is beautiful, that we have a shamanic, we have an indigenous and ancient origin. And for Hindu people to assert that, especially in a time where the key difference is that we are the only ancient living civilization to survive. So that we have, these systems like yoga, for example, we have Ayurveda, is because the Hindu warriors fought for these things to exist, that we fought for the temples to exist. And so that's why the whole world is now benefiting from these things. I think that ultimately Hinduism has been a very open, accepting and sharing culture, civilization. At the same time, it's important to have that reciprocal respect, that we respect the, structures, or we respect the land, we respect the customs. I feel like it's a journey that we are going through as a country. And I see a good future ahead of us. I think that, things are improving in many different ways.
Wonderful. So I just see a certain conflict in this because I have faced it myself. I have seen a lot of identity conflict that happens. Let us say you are from the Christian culture, and I studied in Catholic school, and I belong to a Muslim family. I brought up there. I adopted the Hindu way of identity, the spiritual path. And I also explored the yogic path and, different schools in Himalayas, all of that. But I'm saying there is a conflict. Politically, definitely there is a conflict, but let us say a normal citizen wants to be a part of all identity, and then there is a West and a progressive West in terms of technology, in terms of AI nowadays.
Yeah.
The entire globalism, or something called as a multicultural identity, which goes, which is propagated in corporates mostly, that you have to be a multicultural individual, and one has to be there. And so they do not somehow feel, even when you go to a corporate, people do not like fitting into boxes of, even the tradition. Even if the tradition is very highly rich, let us say the Indian tradition has got multiple schools, the Saivism school, right? Or let us say the Vaishnavism, or different schools.
Yeah.
People do not like to come down from that pedestal of globalism and multicultural identity to taking this traditionally rooted, integrating both or just rooted with their identity, right? So where do you see like this thing? Because sometimes I also see within myself, because for business you have to retain this broader identity among the people in the world. And when it comes to really connecting your heart with the land, with the people, and feeling at home, you have to, it's naturally an embrace. So we show something else for, for branding and for, expanding activities in the world. But then when it's within us, we know that we are deeply connected to this form and this is our
Yeah.
personal. So like, how do you see? Because I see most individuals have that conflict. So they do not talk about identity at all. So
Yeah.
how do you see this, what could be a solution that you think of?
I think identity is a really deep question. I think ultimately it comes down to embracing every single aspect of yourself and every single thing that has been a part of your journey. So for me as well, like I went through a lot of different identity struggles throughout my teenage years. I grew up in England and then I came here. And so ultimately it reached a point where I had to resolve that within myself and find acceptance for the different parts of my journey, even if they were unpleasant. I think sometimes if, a lot of people go to say a Catholic or a convent school and then are kind of brainwashed into thinking pagans are evil and that, this is all just witchcraft. And so people do come out of that with a lot of resentment towards what they went through in school. Even, certain types of abuse. I think it's important for us to kind of make peace with the different conflicting aspects of our identity and understand what is true for us now and keep pursuing that. In terms of what you mentioned about multiculturalism and globalism, like there is an increased push to actually, I feel, dilute people's individual identity in the name of globalism, in the name of multiculturalism. And I think that's where, each person kind of asserting their right to have independent thought, right? So for example, someone may be extremely leftist, but someone may not be a leftist. So I think the more people that counter the mainstream narrative, the more space that there is for others to be in their unique identity. I think it's an ongoing journey of exploration, and ultimately the spiritual identity that you mentioned is one. It's what connects the soul. It's what connects nature. And I think that the more in my journey I've aligned with that aspect of myself, the more easier it has been for me to embrace people of different identities as well.
Wow. So so essentially, because what we think, as Buddha used to say, what we think we become, what we think we feel, right?
Yeah.
So, because if we have multiple identical thoughts in our mind, we will also process that kind of a complex chemical experience and energetic experience within ourselves. To have it sorted out, at least psychologically, it's important for individuals so that they feel at ease, while proceeding to spirituality. So I think that's it for, you have been really doing a good job in,
Thank you. Thanks.
sharing spiritual experiences, and I hope to see, I have seen many people getting benefited from your courses and things. So would you like to give some, advice or any message or anything from your side? Because definitely many people watch you, right? In Instagram or other platforms. Yeah.
I mean, I would say one thing is that don't dissociate spirituality from the three-dimensional real world. I think too often the narrative that we have in our minds is that spirituality is like this bubble of just sitting and meditating and being at peace. But the real spirituality comes into play when you acknowledge your shadows, when you sit in your mess, and you also acknowledge that there's a dharma that we all have as individuals within the world, right? And so in this time of what I term as spiritual warfare, right? There's a war on our biology through the modern system. There's a war on our minds through the media, through the education system, a war on our children. If we truly want to liberate ourselves, we are going to have to understand that liberation is not going to just happen in isolation, that as committed as we should be to our spiritual practice, to seeking, right? The journey of seeking, I feel, is something that's very crucial as well. equally, we should be committed to understanding that, firstly, that we deserve to succeed in the world, to live the type of lifestyle that we want. And secondly, that we have a responsibility to create change in the world as well, right? So I think, that activism aspect is often demonized in the spiritual community. Materialism is sometimes, again, it's demonized, but that's why, the four purusharths of life, so dharma, artha, which means wealth, kama, enjoyment, and moksha. And I think that having all of that in balance is going to be necessary for individuals to cope up with what's going to come in the next few years, from a spiritual side, and then also an economic and the kind of world issues.
Wonderful. So thank you for joining and giving out your time for this podcast. And so I think this will be really helpful for the audience, those who are watching. So they can also, so you guys, if you're watching, you can just follow her on Instagram.
I would say one more thing is that, I think based on all the kind of discussions we've had, is that I think there's a kind of bottom line that each and every individual is unique. And we have a unique soul purpose for which we have come into this world. And that process of discovery and self-belief into what, is your passion, what is your calling, I think it's really key to believe in that, because there are so many forces trying to stop us from believing in ourselves. And so that's one thing I'd add, is that, just always believe and remain connected to your soul, and the soul will guide the way.
Okay. So what do you think about, like, before we end, I had a certain query. So, like, what do you think about the role of psychology in this? Let us say you talk about the shadow, right? Then Carl Jung spoke about the shadow. And then we have Nietzsche, his dramatic psychological analysis, and now we have Jordan Peterson, TheJHPodcast, and we have many psychologists who have worked on the mind. And in a way, working on the mind is also spirituality, right? Like, let us say
100%.
Yeah, so Swami Vivekananda, I read one of his books of Swami Vivekananda, Reflections, and Osho also wrote a lot of books. But essentially, they try to work on the mind in a completely their own way, destroying the, I'll not say destroying identifications, but there is this one verse in the Patanjali Yoga Sutra, I guess, that do not be identified with anything, like, the stillness is the only identity. So what do you think about, okay, definitely Hindu traditions and methods as a means, there are many ways in different cultures, but psychology as a means of, becoming spiritual. So have you explored that? Because you spoke some terminology, so I thought you might have.
Yeah, I think there's huge benefit in what's happening in modern, you could call it modern psychology, but I think it's a cross between psychology and spirituality in terms of things like, healing understanding our karmic patterns is a big thing, where we have, these ritualistic ways, for example, making offerings for our ancestors or for certain types of planets can really help us to get to the core of those karmic patterns, which often we are carrying since lifetimes, right? But then the psychology aspect allows us to apply our intellect and understand, okay, what are the patterns that I keep repeating? How do I heal them? How do I come into more self-love, more self-acceptance? And so understanding our shadow, all the things that we keep repressed, I think it's an ongoing journey, but definitely have enormous value for self-improvement, for inner transformation.
So that's it. Thank you for joining, Kamya ji, and thanks for giving your time for the podcast. So those of you watching can follow Kamya ji on her Instagram and Twitter. So I will definitely put the links in the description. And please let us know how you find this podcast. If you have any queries, please drop in the comments.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining.
Thanks a lot. Great speaking to you. See you soon. Bye. Namaskaram. Namaskaram.